So welcome to this class about the dynamic piece sacrifices in the King's Indian defense. And this is the program as I imagine it. So the King's Indian defense for black is an interesting opening because it is semi-closed, sometimes even closed, and most of the pieces are left on the board. And because of that, and because the queens are usually left on the board too, white would like to exchange them in many cases, but is not able to, then there are a lot of opportunities to attack the king. And because there are many pieces left on the board, this idea of sacrificing one of them for maybe a couple of pawns and then still have a lot of pieces left to attack with, it becomes an opportunity. So there's a lot of sacrificial opportunities and also a lot of transformations. So we will look into that. Okay. Game 4 of Nakamura versus Karana was an amazing King's Indian defense. Okay, great. So let's see, let's start out. So I'm going to look at positions where the central structure is fixed with black pawns on the dark squares. So that is c4, d6, e5. So we will have a few of those, but we will not only look at those positions. And we shall look at positions where white has a way to sacrifice a knight on this structure, maybe get 2 pawns, and then get passed 1-2 passed pawns in the center. And the reason that this is an option is that after white has played d4 to d5, he has taken space in the center. And this space is one of the reasons why these underlying dynamic piece sacrifices is an option. The same can be said for black. If black has taken space on the king side, let's say with f5, f4, this space advantage also allows certain piece sacrifices. Knight takes g4, knight takes e4, bishop takes h3. So we will get into position soon, so I will be able to show it. So if white wants to sacrifice on this structure, then it matters where the black knight might be. And in the Middlegames Platter variation, this is one of the first games we're going to look at, the knight on e7 is far away from c5. And then sometimes it's difficult to stop that sacrifice on c5. In other cases, that knight on b8 might be developed to a6 or a5 after c6 and then to a5. Then this knight might be far away from the king side. And that might prompt white to sacrifice a piece, simply because the piece that black is left with as an extra piece is far away on the queen side. So yeah, then other minor piece sacrifices I put in here too, and some other piece transformations. So that was just a brief overlook, and the games, they will speak for themselves once we get started. So I will stop sharing my screen and then let's get to the games. Okay. So this first game is between Kortsnoy and Fischer. And we are going to look at the classical variation of the King's Indian defense with e5. I assume you all know what the King's Indian defense is prior to this class. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to put them in the chat. Let me see. I will make sure you can only write to me. So if you have an answer to a question, you're not giving anything away. So now this is the Middlegames Platter variation, knight c6. And the idea is to provoke white to, or force white to release this tension on d4 by going d5. And then this knight on e7, it's very double-edged. It's far away from e5. this is typically where white wants to break. So this knight is not really doing anything to defend against that. On the other hand, later it will be easier for black to transfer this knight to the king side. So it's a very double-edged strategy. Nowadays b4 is the main move. But this game, white played knight d2. I remember looking at this move in the 90s, and I think the reason it's maybe not so popular anymore is because of a5. And then white will have to use extra time in order to play b4 because of this rook is hanging. So white is losing a little bit time in the race on the queen side there. So, but in this game, Fischer played c5. And actually, Kortsnoy played h3 here, h3. But let's look at rook b1, which is more to the point. Black wants to push f5 and take space over here. White naturally wants to play b4. So these are the pawn races going on. So b6. We're also going to talk in other positions. This knight will be on the knight here on d2 will be on d3. And then we're going to talk about these two pawn breaks, b2 and f4. So this is not necessarily a piece sacrifice or anything, but this pawn break is important. And although it looks like white might get a backward pawn on c4, e4 here, then white gets other advantages. So it's just an idea you have to know with white, that don't worry too much about these backward pawns when this break comes. For instance, that's one reason why rook b1 is more to the point than a3. So play could continue along the same lines. It's just that rook b1 is much more useful than a3. And again, white doesn't have to fear this taking on b4. So in our case here, taking on b4, for instance, will create this hole on c5. But experience has shown that white will somehow break through over here. So having these slight weaknesses here doesn't really matter that much. It's more important to be fast. And we won't look too much into this b2 b4 break. Later we will look a little bit into the f2 f4 break that leaves the e4 pawn backward. So it's just important to know, and with white you shouldn't worry too much, and we will discuss why. So black instead decides to keep c5 defended. And this is in general the whole idea of this structure. You're just trying to keep everything solid, and then you want to attack on the other side. So black does that. And knight on b3, knight on d3. The question remains the same. This knight could end up getting stuck with nowhere to go, really. So it's actually what happened in the Kortsnoy-Fischer game. And Fischer took over the position because white wasn't able to do anything. But here we have an interesting position. And let's say if black goes ahead with f5, then white has this bishop g5. And let's say something like this. Suddenly the knight enters on c6, and white has a lot of... White is about to break through on the queen side, so that's kind of like white's aim. Somehow get through to the queen side, then there will be a lot of play over there, and white will be first instead of giving black time to build up on the king side. So the moment white is just able to somehow break into the queen side, that's usually a problem for black. So this is slight advantage for white. Then black could get this idea of, let's wait with the king. And if bishop g5, then You can always play f6, so nothing is really happening. And it doesn't look so easy for white to break through here. a5 is defended now by the queen. Knight b5 can maybe just be kicked away. So how to break through on the queen side. And there's the following underlying dynamic piece sacrifice is actually very important and happens quite a lot. Let's say bishop a3, bishop e3, then f5, f3. Then black can go f4 and continue to build up on the king side with g5. And even if black doesn't go g5 right away, it's very hard to stop this knight takes c5 piece sacrifice coming up. So if you try to play queen c7, then knight b5, let's say something like this, knight b5. And then I also have the option of sacrificing on d6, which is also an idea. So sacrifice on c5, e5, d6, depending on circumstances. I've sealed them all, so they do happen. And then these pawns can start to move forward after the knight sacrifice for 2 pawns. So one of the things why this works is this space that white has gained with the d5 pawn. The white's pawns are simply closer to promotion. So that's the advantage of the space. Okay, so let's see, g5 takes here. And then there's a couple of ideas. So now this knight is pinned. So there is one idea of playing rook g8, where the rook usually belongs anyway. And then later we can transfer the knight here. And black will have to seek counterplay over here on the king side before the white's pawn are just marching up the board. So you can either play rook g8, or it's actually possible to play knight g6 right away, because white has no intention of taking that rook, because he will then lose the dark squares in the center. So, so all these ideas are basically a result of a position where there's so many pieces left. So this works for black. There's a blockade, but there's also still the opportunity of a kingside attack, simply due to the queens are still on the board. If you were white and you could take the queens off the board here, then probably this is a winning endgame, probably. But the dynamic of the position is that the queens are still there, and usually it's very hard for white to just force the exchange of queens, unless you want to do it in the opening with the exchange variation, but that's a completely different story. So black is usually able to keep the queens on the board. So this is, black has a lot of compensation here. I actually think giving up that exchange, or white shouldn't have taken it, but black is probably better here because of the dark square control. So white would probably just drop that bishop back and then play c5 here. And black can go for g4, and we have a very sharp position, but white is probably slightly better here. So quite fascinating. And in all these semi-close positions, we talked about double-S bishops last week. And here we can definitely point out 2 bishops that look to be just positioned behind the own pawn. But they both have an important function. This bishop is, for instance, defending the g4 square. Black's bishop is maybe, yeah, we saw how it suddenly could drop back here to f8. And it's also defending the black king. So as we talked about last week, this is just a position with so many things going on, so many pieces, space on d5, space on f4. So it doesn't make sense to single out one piece and call it a bad piece. So it really depends on the circumstances. Also, after we sacrifice this knight on 2 pawns, say, it might be very useful to have this, let's say, goalkeeper down here defending the pawns. And once they start move forward, then this bishop can maybe also come alive. So yeah, there's too much happening here to single out these bishops, call them bad. Okay, I can briefly show you what happened in the game. A3. And this is the moment where white lost an important tempo here. It was F5, F3, and F4. And now white failed to make this maneuver. So now there are no sacrifices on C5. So basically, white is stuck here without real counterplay. So the knight on B3 easily becomes stuck on this square because there are no options to do anything. And black was able to build up. The rook is perfect here, supporting G4, defending D6. So black is just able to build up his position here, and he won a nice game. So that game will be in the database. We're not going to go deeper into that now. That was just to start out with how complex these positions can be. So let's move on to the next example. So this is also this structure. And the check Benoni has a couple of flaws. By defining that pawn structure so early on, it gives white a lot of options to just adjust his play accordingly. So in the King's Indian, this C5 always happens later. Fischer played it on move 9. Sometimes black can go C6 first and then C5 later. So in the King's Indian, it always comes later depending on circumstances. In the check Benoni, black has simply shown his hand too early. So white has a lot of ways to get an advantage here. I think Auruk, he suggests an idea like this, just to take space on the king side before doing anything else, leaving that knight here back for a moment on G1. So you see with an early declaration, the pawns have been declared here in the center, so white can, for instance, leave the knight back on G1 and play for other things in the position. So let's see what happened in the game. There's an interesting moment coming up where, so white transfers the knight to D3, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. And yeah, now white is focusing a lot on the B5 square, holding back this B5 push. And here the bishop on E2 also plays a big role. And one of the advantages of the check Benoni is that black wants to play bishop G5 and somehow get rid of his problem bishop, his double-edged bishop there. And then the argument is we're trying to isolate this one. But again, there are more things happening, and even though you could call this a small victory for black, there are much more is going on in this position. White still had this space advantage. This knight might look a little bit dominated by white's pawns after this. White has several ways to play this. H6. Black could consider to play something like B6 just to stop A5 from happening. But so it happened like this. And this pawn structure might not be so bad for black. Let's say maybe this could happen later, and this is fairly easy to defend. But especially this knight on C7 might be slightly misplaced. So this space advantage for white makes it a little bit difficult to move the pieces around. So and now black played rook A8, definitely going for a push of the A pawn if given the chance. Not sure. G5 doesn't look too appealing, but it does stop white from playing F4. So maybe worth a thought. After rook a4, a8, white played f4. So this is always an interesting break. And one of these ideas is, that's why we put the knight on d3, to influence all these squares here. So it does give a backward e4 pawn after this. But here we have to look at all the advantages. And what else were we supposed to do here? So, so again, this is just something we have to learn from this position. There's no point in playing g3 first. It's simply too slow. Yeah, it does happen. So the question was, does white ever play g4 instead of f4 to stop f5? That does happen, yeah. So there are multiple lines in the King's Indian where g4 is played, maybe f3 or h3, typical lines where this is played early, and then g4 comes to either stop f5, or if black plays f5, then we can maybe open the g file, or we can capture twice here and get this square on e4 for knight. So g4 is definitely an idea. But I would say black is ill-equipped to play f5 here, and that the main reason for that is the black knights that are so far away. So let's say f5 we take, and then we get this square, and these two knights seems to be stuck over here. So so white can simply develop a strong initiative by opening up the center, probably with something like f4. So black shouldn't do that. So f4 here, takes. And this idea of playing e5 here is very strong, of course. Then we would get a passed pawn on d5. So black plays f6. And even though black has this square firm in grip, but this is backward, white has space. And right now it's not possible to just transfer the knight to e5 because this pawn is hanging. And there's a lot of things going on in this position. So it's not just about, let's say, this backward pawn and this nice outpost for a knight or something. So there's a lot of transformations that work in white's favor here, simply because of the space. And there are also dynamic piece sacrifices. So this position I will show here is more about playing that pawn break and not worry too much about potential pawn weaknesses. So Gligorich, he does sacrifice a piece later, but not so sure about that decision, and he kind of lost control a little bit, ended up winning the game, but it could have gone differently. Black had some defensive resources. So it's more about for the pawn break than the piece sacrifice. So black relied on this idea of playing g5 here. And if the queen moves, then this pawn could be hanging. So Gligorich, he ended up playing knight f5, something like this, and trying to exchange queens. And so e4 is a little bit come under attack, but black still has the problems with the knights, and so white is trying to attack these weaknesses here, and the black king is also open. So that's also a theme. Because of the open black king, then you start to think about some piece sacrifices. So even with a piece sacrifice here, there would still be many pieces left to start an attack against the black king. So this is how the game continued, and knight comes back to e5. And now white decided to break through here on the queen side, which was very exciting. And it looks like the player were in time trouble, but maybe it wasn't the best approach. Let's try to go back for a little bit. because there was an interesting moment here after g5. And I think this is where the engine, the chess engine, can be of great help in analyzing this position, because he played knight f5 here. Maybe he didn't like the idea of playing a simple move like queen f3. Simply taking the time to maneuver around, simply claiming that you have a space advantage and there might be a hole here on e5 and e4 might be weak, but there are also holes over here, so we might be able to do things ourselves, maybe get the bishop out here and then maybe threaten a dynamic pawn sacrifice like this just to open up the position. So when the engine suggests continuations like these that are slightly slower and just shows you that white has a great position as it is, doesn't have to prove anything, like doesn't have to find a brutal solution to the problem, but can just play the position quietly or slow down a little bit. That is something to take notice of, I think. So I try to play a few moves here. Let's say this idea of a5, a4, and trying to exchange some pieces also makes sense. Maybe the knight can jump to c3 here. So I just played a few moves here. Now we are attacking these two pawns. So king g7 makes sense. And then a check, queen takes. And now, well, it looks like maybe white doesn't have a lot in this position. And what about knight c3? But already here, the engine claims that white is just winning, simply because bishop d3 followed by e5 cannot be stopped. And this shows two things, I believe, two instructive things. So it shows that even in this position, white has enough material left to be able to sacrifice one piece and still have an attack. Okay. It also shows that this bishop on e2, that double-edged bishop that doesn't look so great, is actually going to turn out to be our game changer, because there's going to be mates on g6, and so on the surface, this position doesn't look anything special for white, but actually black is already lost here. So knight c3, then bishop d3, and e5 cannot be stopped. Okay, so then we could get this idea, why not just play f5, h5, kick that knight away, and then try to defend. But then it turns out that the same idea is just devastating. And there's too much happening here. So yeah, this is made right away. And otherwise, it's just, there's no defense here, really. So yeah, difficult for a human to play like this, but it's interesting to see that how white's position was just stable and good. No need to prove anything. Okay, but Grigorich, he played something like this. Let's get to the moment where he played b4. And now c5 is probably, now it's just unclear after this. But black failed to, so this happened in the game. Very complicated. And in this position, black missed a tactic for white. Rook takes g5 because the rook on f8 is hanging. So he went knight b8, and then white is just winning here. So knight b8 was not the move. He could have played something like rook e8 here, and it's really unclear what's going on here. So so let's see. In this position, white can The chess engine is like this move: knight takes b4, and then just take it easy. And then we want to jump to c6 with the knight. Let's say something like this. And here we again have to talk about the dynamic factors of this position. Open black king, pass pawn on c6, possible pawn breaks just to open up for this bishop, or multiple weaknesses here and here. So all these ideas is white is just better here. A5 might also be weak. So and white has the safer king. So there's a lot of things going on. It's not just that bishop on e2. So even if we don't look at this bishop, white still has two rooks and a queen, and black has these weaknesses and an open king. And then white can join in with this bishop later. So taking everything that goes on in the position into account, white is just better here. Okay. So that was an interesting idea. I can briefly show you what happened in the game. This was the moment where he failed to play rook f e8. And then, so the end of the game was very nice. Here white has a mate in 2 moves. Can anyone find it? Mm-hmm. Yep. H4 is the move, and then queen f4. Let's say king g4 or king takes, then we have queen f4, checkmate. And if king g6, we simply need to give a check. So knight f4 is checkmate. So very nice, but white definitely lost some control there when he tried to break through with c5. So this way of winning didn't look clean at all. But anyway, nice game. Okay, and then I want to show a brief game fragment. We're going to see it from the black side after rook g3. And in this position, black is 2 pawns up and has a winning position. So one idea is simply to play something like h5 to protect that knight. But Rajabov, he played a different way. He transformed his advantage into something completely different to win the game and take it to an endgame and win it from there. And I think it depends on the type of player you are, because I definitely would have done something similar if I could, and I have done on occasions. This idea of transforming the advantage into something else and then win it, it's maybe with some material imbalance, is I'm very attracted to that idea. Other players, they are more, let's call it stable. Let's say they have 1-2 pawns up and then just keep the material distribution as it is, and then win a slow game like that. No need to make big changes, transformations. So h5 is, let's say, one type of player, the quiet way of winning it, and queen h4 is the other. So we're 2 pawns up. So the idea of going into rook versus 2 minor pieces is not far off. I saw a lot of these transformations when I wrote the book about rook versus 2 minor pieces. So we make sure we exchange queens, which is important. And now the rooks come into the position, and white has a real problem with these 2 knights tied down to each other. So this is a fairly easy win. With the 2 rooks here, white king might also be in trouble. Some ladder mate, something. So white has to seek some counterplay, taking that d6 pawn. So he's trying f5. And he's trying to get some counterplay going. The knight on e2 is hanging. Let's see. Yeah. Let's see. Knight g3, c3. And now he just takes on c1 and transform it back to an endgame with two pawns up. So white resigned at this point. So all kinds of transformations are possible, especially when you already started out with, let's say, 1 to 2 pawns for one side. Yeah. So that was just a brief example. Another transformation I saw, let's say when I wrote rook versus 2 minor pieces, is this idea at if you sacrifice a knight for 2 pawns and then goes an exchange, then it could suddenly get rook and 2 pawns for bishop and knight. And then it all depends. But then the side with the rook usually have the initiative. And then, so there are some interesting transformation between, let's say, first a pawn sacrifice, then an exchange sacrifice, and then it can go to rook versus 2 minor pieces. So it kind of happens like this, and especially in positions like the King Indian, where you have all the rooks, the minor pieces left on the board. So that makes all these different options possible. Okay, let's look at this game. This is an example where this black knight on b8, we saw that in the modeled platter variation, black rushed it to the king side. So now we're going to look at an example where this knight stays on the queen side to defend over there and is perhaps missing on the other side of the board. So let's see. So the knight a6 variation, black can play e5 first. Knight a6 is a way to quickly get the knight to c5 maybe, and because we defend c7, then maybe we can discourage white from going exchange the queens, the exchange variation. So black is just waiting one move to see what white wants to do. And bishop e3. Yeah, there's also knight g4 here. It's a typical reaction to bishop e3. Let's c6. Yeah, and then c5. And this is a typical example of the King's Indian, where this structure appears later when white has already shown his hand. Castle king side, the knight is on f3, etc. So, okay, knight is on the way to d3, and this knight is attacked. So, yeah, so knight f7. So this is the position we are going to look at. So this white is going to play f4, and this is actually going to be a piece sacrifice because black can take it and then fork these pieces potentially. But one reason why you start to think about white might work is this knight over here out of the game. So if things open up on the king side, you give away one knight, but you still have the rest of the pieces left on the board. You still keep your space advantage in the center, and yeah, so there's a lot of things going on. So another idea is also to play on the queen side, but I think it makes much more sense to just keep the pawn on b2 for the moment. Then this knight has no way to, let's say, get back into the game, taking the pawn on b4 and get to c5. So let's just keep the pawn here for the time being and try to show that this knight on a6 is out of the game. So Cotronius, in his books on the King's Indian, he actually has this line, queen e7, and after knight d3, bishop d7, quick development, and then f4, he suggests g5. So he's aware of this option of white going f4. So that makes a lot of sense to, let's say, move these two pieces here and then get some connection between the rooks and get ready. So g5, and then black will not get into the same kinds of problems that I'm about to show you. So that makes a lot of sense. So this has been played many times, and this is actually Wojciech against Ding Liren from a couple of years back. So, and here I believe white played b4 in the game, but f4 is actually a strong move here. And some of you who were at my book presentation, Opening Simulator King's Indian Defense, I showed this briefly. This time I want to focus on one specific variation, which I find interesting. So here's the idea. We take here first, and then if take back, then there are so many weaknesses over here. First h5, and then there's going to be a meltdown on f6 here. So this is simply too much to handle. I can show you one line here, and then queen d2, and then knight f6 is already a threat. Let's say something like this, and then simply queen c1, and knight f6 is coming. G5 is hanging, and black is simply not ready for this attack coming on the black king. So so there was one line here that we looked at in the Marshall Chess Club when I did the presentation, and on the surface of it, this looks okay for black. Like, now we got a solid pawn structure, and we have this space with f4. Okay, white has space with d5, we have space with f4. And we exchange this h pawn instead of maybe normally another pawn. So now the h pawn is gone. So why should this be so bad for black? But then it turns out, after a move like rook b1, that black's king is still open. It's always an issue in the King's Indian when black tries to advance on the king side, which gives ideas of exchange sacrifices or piece sacrifices. Then, because black is missing that h pawn, it's actually hard to get control over the square g4. So white can anytime play bishop g4 and try to exchange those bishops. The knight is still out of the game. White can play b4 if he wants. And then all these options of opening up the position here if white wants. So black's play over here is basically stopped. It's difficult to... So without g4, this bishop on h6 is not going to be such a dynamic bishop. So it seems like white just have the better pieces and the better options here. So this is a clear advantage for white. So the main point, I will send you the game in the base, and you will see all the different sidelines after this strong novelty. So I won't go too deep into it now, but the point is, and you will see that in maybe one of the puzzles too, that if black has a knight stuck out here on the edge, that might give white some ideas to break through on the other side. So by the way, you see that in other openings as well with black, where, let's say, the Grünfeld, in many lines, it's a very risky strategy to put that knight out on a5, because, well, it's nice to have the c4 square under control, and if you if you play on the queen side, then this knight on a5 is very useful. But if white suddenly starts a kingside attack, then this knight is suddenly far away on a5. There's also many lines of the Zuckertort where a knight ends on a5, and similar lines where black puts the knight on a5. So it's a relatively modern approach for black, put the knight out here, but it could be very risky if the white player knows what he's doing and is ready to start an attack and maybe give away some material. So very interesting. Okay, so let's continue. Yeah, let's see another Mar del Plata variation. This time Petrosian plays b4. And we get to a position like this. And here, I forgot the name of the black player here. He plays knight d4 and simply sacrifices that knight on f4. So that's also a very common idea in the King's Indian. So I won't look into that game in detail. So time is running away a little bit. So I will focus on other things. But it is quite the common idea. So there's another, I want to talk about a positional idea here. So white would like to have this square for a knight on e4. So you would think that this is a very clumsy setup with the knight on f4, because then you cannot play the pawn to f4, and if you can't play the pawn to f4, then whenever you move this pawn, then white can take and then get this nice square on e4 for the knight. But this is one of these ideas that I don't really see a problem with it for black. And I also discuss it in my book, Opening Simulator, because yeah, white gets the knight to e4. Let's say white could play the knight to e4 here. But black also gets a knight to d4. And the knight looks fine on e4. But if black can keep pieces on the board, then white might have multiple pieces that would like to be on e4. And with still pieces left on the board, the half-open f-file, dynamic options with e4, still chances to expand on the king side. So white can still just play a position like this with confidence. So this is also an interesting aspect of the King's Indian. Don't necessarily have to fear that white knight jumping to e4 if you can get your own knight to d4. So yeah, and it's interesting in this position. The engines, they give a clear advantage for white, but it's very hard to really untangle white's position here in a very clear way. So the white advantage for the engine is simply based on the material value. It's not like they come up with a line for how white can free his position. So let's just take a few more moves. So, and here we have another idea. Yeah, I'm not sure if g3 was a mistake. Yeah, maybe white can play without that and then just go for knight e4 right away. Perhaps he was afraid of knight d4 taking that bishop out, giving that bishop away. I'm not sure. A move like bishop g4 looks like an option, but it might run into something like queen e8 and h5. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if g3 was a mistake. That's maybe too early to say, but you'll have to do some deep analysis once you get the game afterwards. But it's just interesting to see that, okay, white has, and this happens a lot. If you want to sacrifice this piece for a couple of pawns, then usually it's the knight, or the opponent who has the extra piece is left with an extra knight. So that's usually the case when a piece sacrifice happens. It's usually always the knight, and then the bishops that are left on the board that can support the pawns is usually a powerful combination. So it's just a little bit ironic that the move h3 is the move where the engines turn around completely and say that black is winning. So the moment that white tries to clarify matters, then black goes ahead and gets a winning advantage. So black, in this position, black has very few weaknesses. It's very hard to get at c7, and it might not actually matter that much because maybe white doesn't have time for it. There's a pin on a diagonal because this bishop is undefended. So black has everything covered. It's very hard to point out the weaknesses, which means that black has a great degree of freedom to think about attack only. So black doesn't have to think too much about his own weaknesses. So after h3, the game got into something like this. And then it was just about bringing the rook into the game here. So white tried something desperately, but here he resigned. It's a very nice end to the game because of bishop f3 here. So it seemed to be just one-way traffic after black sacrificed that piece. And even though if white was able to find something better, then it's clear it's a very unpleasant position for white. And black, who has no visible weaknesses and can just think about how to improve with the two bishops and these two pawns, it's very unpleasant for white. Okay, let me just see if we have time for one more example. Yeah, so this was a game I played myself, actually a long time ago. And this was against Danish Grandmaster Carsten Høy, if some of you know him. I don't think he was Grandmaster at the time. So we get into this Mar del Plata variation. At that time I played knight e1. And my opponent is not one for playing a lot of theory. So, and he likes to play these closed structures. They're supposed to be slightly better for white, but these are rich positions where you can definitely play for a win later. So I do agree on that, those positions here after c5. It's not so easy. And I do think that one key is this sacrifice on c5. So it's simply necessary sometimes if you don't want to just get stuck. And you want to end up something like Korchnoi-Fischer, where Fischer was just able to expand on the king side, and this knight is stuck. There's no counterplay. So, but as I said, with a knight on e7, it's hard to defend c5. So actually, this sacrifice is going to happen here. And so I sacrificed here on c5, and Carsten Høy, he's still a strong player, so he wants me to take that rook on f8. I don't want to lose control of the dark squares. So, and he's a very dynamic player, Carsten. So he immediately sacrifices a pawn to get counterplay. So threatening d7, and we got into a very exciting position like this. And we were drifting into time trouble here. So white still has the upper hand, but now suddenly he makes transformation into something that's very good for white. So at this point, I am winning. So I just want to show you one moment where the advantage transforms. Now he cannot allow me to play c6 here. So he played rook c8. And after queen f6, this was move 40. So at the time it was 40 moves, time control. So this was my last move, but here's a nice transformation of the advantage. And then c6. And then we go into this endgame where I cannot take the bishop because c1 is hanging. But after b5, there's just too many pawns there. So he tried to defend actively with some kind of counterplay with bishop, pawn, and rook against my king, maybe. But he resigned after rook a4 because I'm going to play rook a8 and then win the bishop here, and then I can give up my bishop here, and then the rook endgame with 2-3 pawns up is totally winning. So so that's how that game ended. So you will see this theme in the puzzles as well. Okay, that was the presentation I wanted to show. And once we go through the puzzles, the 8 puzzles, then you will see many more themes and interesting positions from the King's Indian defense. So any final questions? Otherwise, we will go offline for half an hour. I'll be back 8:30 and do the 8 puzzles. Let me know if you didn't get them. Then I can still email them. All right, then good luck with the puzzles and see you 8:30. Bye.